Okay, so now let's look at some of the things happening. Currently, there's some optimism in the UK. They say that the vaccines seem to be working, numbers of infections are going down, the restrictions are being lifted, and we hope that by the end of the lockdown on June the 21st, it will all be over and we'll be free to go back to what we were before, or not quite. Some are saying it may happen even sooner. Nevertheless, the government actually has talked about keeping control orders until October, or urging caution, or is it September? Anyway, a long time in the future. They're warning that new strains may bring a new wave of infections despite the vaccines. The EU is incredibly badly affected at the present time, with France and Germany particularly affected, and they're saying that the virus could spread with new infections coming from the continent. Actually been a lot of criticism of the European Union, which has been quite good for Brexiteers like me, as we've said that the European Union has made a total mess of things so far. We're better off out of it. But even so, Macron, Merkel, and Ursula von der Leyen are now sort of coming together with a plan to rescue the EU from their troubles as well. So are we heading out of the woods? Is there peace and safety coming? Or is there another wave of destruction? Rather fascinatingly, today's newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, has a heading, World Leaders Call for Pandemic Treaty. World Leaders Call for Pandemic Treaty. It says, Johnson, Macron and Merkel propose a global accord akin to that forged after the Second World War. The world needs a global settlement similar to that formed after the Second World War to protect states in the wake of the coronavirus, Boris Johnson and other world leaders warned today. In an article in the Daily Telegraph, the Prime Minister, Emmanuel Macron, the French President, Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, cautioned that the virus has been a stark and painful reminder that no one is safe until everyone is safe. Following growing international tension over vaccine supplies, they call for an end to isolationism and nationalism in favour of a new era of solidarity. The international call by 24 world leaders, alongside Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, I think that's how you pronounce him, the head of the World Health Organization, is made today in the Daily Telegraph and newspapers around the world, including Le Monde in France, El País in Spain, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung in Germany. The leaders insist a treaty akin to the second settlement forged in the wake of the Second World War is needed to build cross-border cooperation ahead of the next international health crisis, and described coronavirus as the biggest challenge to the global community since the 1940s. They say at that time, following this devastation of two world wars, political leaders came together to forge the multilateral system. The aims were clear: to bring countries together, to dispel the temptations of isolationism and nationalism, to address the challenges that could be achieved together in the spirit of solidarity and cooperation, namely peace, prosperity, health and security. Peace and safety, peace and security. Get all the nations together, make a treaty, and rebuild the world, build back better. Sounds good, doesn't it? Or is it? Is this actually another sign that all this is actually part of a process which is leading towards some kind of a global government, which, if you follow through Revelation 13, will end up with the government of the Antichrist and the Mark of the Beast system being set up? Now, we're not there yet, but you can see that these things are being talked about and they're even being planned right now. The other issue which is before us is the issue of the vaccine certificate. Are we on the way to a vaccine certificate? A few months ago, Boris Johnson and his government said that there'll be no vaccine certificate, but now he seems to be moving in that way. Headline here says, vaccine passport to go to the pub. You're going to need some kind of a passport, some kind of a ID system. And the paper here describes how it could work, how the papers prepare for the pub. And it's got a little scenario here, how you're going to have to download information from the NHS app onto your phone. They would then be able to access your own medical records to prove you're COVID safe. And then you would have to have one of three things in their records: a COVID vaccination, a recent negative test or an antibody test to show they'd already had the virus and still had immunity. Once someone had one of these, the phone app would give them a virtual certificate, probably including a QR code that they could present at pubs, nightclubs, theatres and other venues. This certificate would also include a picture of the person's face so the staff could be reassured it was genuine. And here you've got actually a picture of the girl with a word vaccine across her forehead and the QR code underneath it. So you've got the mark on her forehead and the code underneath it. Kind of interesting. Are we going to be moving that way? And could it be made mandatory? Could it be made requirement in order to go to work, in order to go on the tube, in order to go to, even to come to church? An article in the Metro said it's possible that people who refuse to get vaccination may be banned from coming into work, according to Conservative MP Tom Tugendhat. He said, I can certainly see a day when businesses say, look, you've got to return to the office, and if you're not vaccinated, you're not coming. It goes on to describe how a company called Onfido has been invited to supply a proposal for digital health certificates to the UK's Parliament. And it would be using a digital identity by uploading the official document, such as a passport or a driver's license, along with a selfie taken on their phone, would be verified using AI technology. Identity would then be paired with a certificate of immunity issued by the NHS. People could then get their QR code on their phone that'd be scanned to enter workplaces, public venues or airports. Does that strike you as being a good idea, or would you be a little bit alarmed about it? I'd be a little bit alarmed about it, for sure. And what's more, the vaccines minister, Nadeem Zahawi, is reputed to have said that churches may have to take people's COVID status before they're allowed in. Which could then mean that put us in a very difficult situation, because I certainly wouldn't agree to that. So do we end up having to be a kind of underground church? So you can see that there is a process which is taking place here, which is very dangerous. Something like this is already operating actually in China and in Israel, and has become the key to opening up after the disastrous lockdown. Opening up with the COVID pass, which is the way to be free of restrictions. And if you're against this, you become one of the kind of nasty conspiracy theory people who are on the anti-vaxxers list, who are a hostile force, who are stopping the progress towards the exit from the lockdown. So we need to be a little bit careful how we handle this one. Basically, I think we should actually be telling the government we don't want tax certificates. And if you want to write to your MP about that, that might be an idea. Because against human rights, against freedom of conscience, could end up being against freedom of movement. And in Israel, people are already very worried about this. People are opposed to it. They've seen the religious police, the police actually targeting people in synagogues as they go to synagogues. And there's been pictures of police going into synagogues and scuffles between people, religious people, and the police. And we see it being proposed here and also being proposed in the EU, United States, Australia, other countries to follow. If that happens, then it would be certainly a connection to Revelation 13, because in Revelation 13 you read how you are given a mark of the beast, and without that mark you can't buy or sell. In other words, enter into normal society. So if your entrance into society means you have to have this certificate in order to go to work, to go to school, to go to shop, even to go to church, then it could become a restriction to anyone who doesn't have it. And the government may have said it's not going to be mandatory, but if it becomes something which you need in order to participate in society, it might as well become mandatory. And you've got this kind of surveillance technology which is being developed, particularly in China, which makes the possibility of some kind of a health passport to survey where you go, what you do, being very real. A man called Chris Black, who writes on the internet, who's definitely anti this process, has said the great purge of civil liberties has begun. Says no jab, no freedom of movement. With a vaccine passport, no matter what it is called, we enter the second phase of Operation COVID. Phase 1 consisted of crushing the population with draconian restrictions, imposing a police regime unimaginable a year ago in a world that was called itself free. Exactly 1 year after we were locked in our houses and forced to wear masks all the time, here comes hope. You can fly, baby, fly, but on one condition, get the jab. You see what they did there? You must get the vaccine not for your health, but for freedom. It's not also certain you can't still be infected after the vaccination, so you're going to need to get the vaccination over and over again. Otherwise, you might infect people, and you're going to need it for your freedom. Chris notes that the emphasis has been on vaccines, not on finding a cure. Says this is actually quite strange because really finding a cure would be much cheaper and less disruptive of society. Says, isn't it strange, this overflowing optimism of betting everything on a vaccine that seemed utopian and nothing on a much more affordable treatment, and all the governments rushed to advance big pharma companies huge amounts of money for experimental vaccines, but no one was interested in finding a treatment. And in fact, some of the drugs which they said would work, like remdesivir and another one, were kind of pushed down and not used in the treatment. He concludes that the lockdown of the vaccine has a triple essential function: 1, to oppose obedience; 2, for verification and control of the people; and 3, for sorting out believers in the New World Order narrative from non-believers, those who follow the narrative and those who will not. And it'll lead to some kind of a surveillance society. From the US, there's a guy called Tyler Durden. He says something pretty similar. He said, what started out a year ago as an apparent effort to prevent a novel coronavirus from sickening the nation and the world has become yet another means by which world governments, including our own, can expand their powers, abuse their authority, and further oppress their constituents. Until recently, the police state has been more circumspect in its power grabs, but this latest state of emergency has brought the beast out of the shadows. The government has weaponized one national crisis after another in order to expand its powers. The war on terror, the war on drugs, the war on illegal immigration, asset forfeiture schemes, road safety schemes, school safety schemes, eminent domain. All of these programs started out as legitimate responses to pressing concerns and have since become weapons of compliance and control in the police state's hands. Doesn't even matter what the nature of the crisis is, might be as long as it allows the government to justify all manner of government tyranny in the name of so-called national security. This coronavirus pandemic has been no exception. Not only have the federal and state governments unraveled the constitutional fabric of the nation and lockdown mandates that sent the economy into tailspin, wrought havoc with our liberties, but they've almost persuaded the citizenry to depend on the government for financial handouts, medical intervention, protection, and sustenance. This past year under lockdown was a lesson in many things, but most of all, it was a lesson in how to indoctrinate the populace to love and obey Big Brother. You might think that's a bit strong, but I think it's pretty much lines up with what's happened. And you're looking all the time for the government to provide, the government to look after you. Certainly not allowed to look to the Lord. So is all this part of a plan, or is it just a ghastly accident? Or are they actually working for our good? It's interesting, if you go back in time, you can see that there has been a long-term kind of plan in order to bring about something like what we're seeing happening now. Back in 1982, there was a man called Zbigniew Brzezinski. He was the US National Security Advisor. He's also strongly into what we might call global governance. He was the founder of something called the Trilateral Commission with David Rockefeller, which was a New World Order, one world government institution. He foresaw a time when, quote, the technotronic era involves the gradual appearance of a more controlled society. Such a society would be dominated by an elite, unrestrained by traditional values. Soon it will be possible to assert almost continuous surveillance over every citizen and maintain up-to-date complete files containing even the most important personal information about the citizen. These files will be subject to instantaneous retrieval by the authorities. So that was running in 1982, when the computer age was way behind what it is now. But he was saying there's a time coming when we'll be able to use these kind of crises to bring about this kind of society. And he talked about he founded the Trilateral Commission with David Rockefeller, wrote a book called Between Two Ages, America's Role in the Technocracy Era in 1982. He said the definition of the technocracy is the government or control of society or industry by an elite of technical experts. In other words, not the people you vote into power, but somebody behind them who is controlling the government and who's controlling the society. To do this, you need to have all this surveillance, this biometric stuff, and a surveillance culture. Do we see that coming in the world today? You certainly do, especially in China, but they're seeing ways in which this could be used all over the world. You've got organizations called like ID 2020, which has the goal of giving everyone on the planet their own personal ID. And it's usually seen as a positive thing. It'll help refugees, it'll help people who are poor and who don't have any bank accounts, and it will bring them into a place where they can have access to society without any problems. But it can also lead to a kind of surveillance culture like that of George Orwell's 1984. And particularly we see that Western countries are paying attention to China's use of technology to monitor its citizens. The Rockefeller Foundation back in 2010 wrote a report called Scenarios for the Future of Technology and Human Development. Gave a Lockstep scenario as one of its possible futures, situations for human societies. With martial law imposed, a breakdown in the social order, quarantines, borders closing, etc., all happening as a result of a global pandemic. The Chinese model was seen as being more successful in that scenario, giving it existing ability to control its citizens. Concern was raised regarding China's success in developing forms of artificial intelligence, was also already raised in 2019 by the US government, with plans of how to deal with this and how to develop their own forms of surveillance, control and monitoring now seen since the pandemic. So you have the implementation of forms of digital ID, and you have organizations coming together, Microsoft, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Gavi Vaccine Alliance, as well as technology companies, and their aim is to bring together governments and nations into this kind of one world system with technological control over the citizens. And has their site says that they want private sector engagement is critical for solving these matters. In other words, what is beyond the capacity of national governments, ID 2020 states it has to be a transnational operation given the limits of national governments. And they talk about this ID system that is private, portable, persistent and personal, and even talk about microchips inserted to bring it about. Bill Gates has said that he sees some form of digital ID as necessary to monitor vaccine uptake, in turn to be a form of control that would dictate a person's freedom to attend events, to work, to travel, amongst other things. Biometric ID also lends itself to be used as a coercion and economic exploitation. If these private organizations decide to press governments to agree, then governments will not be in control of the data and how it's used. So these are articles, obviously, which are critical of it, but they're saying that what you could be seeing now is the beginning of a process which leads to some kind of outside force controlling all your data, controlling how people live, ending up with this surveillance state in which you are basically under Big Brother who's watching you and controlling you. And a lot of people have seen the connection with that, with the Great Reset. I've spoken about that in the past, how they want to reset the world after the pandemic, how to bring about this new world order government in which everything will be changed and there'll be some kind of convergence of the economy, the money, technology, medicals, everything in government systems into this Great Reset, which would also involve consolidating the wealth of the country as well. And likely that would mean that they would take our money, put us all onto some kind of universal basic income, and control what takes place in the government. And their goal also is to shift as much of life as possible onto the internet, leading to a kind of virtual society run by computer algorithms And COVID has actually jump-started this process with thousands of people's jobs, church services, business meetings, even weddings and funerals being conducted online through Zoom and other applications. And once everything's online, it's easier to control and to control what takes place and to censor what takes place. So we put all this kind of stuff online, and somebody can then watch it, and they can say, well, I don't like what Tony Pearce is saying here, so we'll censor him and cut him off. And you can see that this is another danger which we're facing.